Jamie Holt had never been one to follow the guidebooks. At 32, he had built a modest online following by charting bold, unscripted adventures into places others either couldn't find or wouldn't dare enter. And this time, it was India's far northeast, Arunachal Pradesh, that caught his eye. Most travelers stuck to Rajasthan, Goa, or Kerala. But Jamie wanted something raw, something forgotten. He'd heard whispers in online forums about a stretch of jungle near the Myanmar border where GPS signals failed, and old tribes still held to their traditions, untouched by outsiders. It was precisely the kind of place his viewers loved, and he needed a new video to reignite his channel after months of stagnation. In the frontier town of Roing, he gathered supplies, rented a local motorbike, and asked around for trail information. Locals were friendly but cautious, some even visibly nervous. An old shopkeeper warned him not to venture too deep. "The forest remembers," he said cryptically. Jamie chuckled at that. He'd heard similar things in Mongolia, Peru, and even back home in the Scottish Highlands. Warnings were part of the job. Still, he noticed how each conversation ended the same way: averted eyes and vague mentions of a cut-off zone beyond which the terrain became unpredictable and strange. That only fueled Jamie's curiosity. By the second day, he had interviewed a few retired forest rangers who spoke about an unmapped region where even satellites struggled. He tried hiring a local guide, but no one agreed to go past a certain point. One younger man finally whispered a trail name, Kangong Path, but then claimed he'd made a mistake and refused to speak further. Jamie, ever the stubborn explorer, decided to go alone. He packed 2 weeks' worth of rations, extra batteries, a hand-drawn map he cobbled together from various sources, and his trusty DSLR. Before sunrise the next day, he slipped away, documenting every moment for his vlog. The trail began with dense foliage and occasional footprints. For the first 10 hours, everything was manageable, even beautiful. Monkeys chattered overhead, distant birdsong echoed between moss-draped trees, and the sun painted the jungle floor in golden hues. Jamie filmed enthusiastically, describing the trail, pointing out edible plants, and sharing bits of folklore he'd picked up. His phone lost signal within the first 3 miles, just as expected. But he had a compass, a solar charger, and printed maps, which made him feel prepared. His voice in the footage remained confident, even cocky. By late afternoon, he reached a quiet clearing and decided to make camp. The air was thick with humidity, and his shirt clung to his skin. He set up his top and cooked dehydrated noodles on a small burner, smiling into the camera about how this would be the trip that took his channel to the next level. That night, however, something shifted. The forest grew louder, then abruptly still. Frogs stopped croaking. Crickets fell silent. Jamie awoke once, startled by what sounded like footsteps circling his tent. He shouted, but heard only rustling in reply. The next morning, everything seemed normal again, and he chalked it up to nerves or perhaps an animal. But as he repacked and checked his map, he realized the landscape looked subtly different. Trees he swore he passed yesterday were gone, and the path ahead curved in a way that didn't match his notes. Still, undeterred, he pressed forward, blaming his early morning disorientation. By the third day, Jamie had covered over 20 kilometers deeper into the jungle. The trail signs, already rare, vanished entirely. At a fork in the forest, he chose the narrower, overgrown path. He told the camera it was a shortcut, but truthfully, he picked it because it felt more mysterious. That decision would mark the beginning of everything that followed. Rain came suddenly and without warning. The trail turned to slick mud, and his boots sank with every step. At one point, he slipped and scraped his leg, tearing his pants and soaking his gear. Drenched and muddy, he found a hollow beneath a large banyan tree and decided to shelter until the storm passed. He pulled out his camera to record, but the lens fogged up, and his voice cracked with fatigue. When he finally slept that night, it was with his knife gripped tight. Something in the forest no longer felt passive. The air tasted charged, as if unseen eyes had turned toward him. What he didn't know, couldn't yet know, was that he was already off any trail known to locals. What lay ahead wasn't just wilderness. It was something the modern world had long forgotten. A place beyond time, beyond maps, and beyond logic. And once crossed into, it would not easily let him leave. By the time the storm subsided, the world around Jamie had changed completely. The trail, already faint, had dissolved beneath the weight of cascading rain and shifting mud. Trees that once stood as markers were now obscured by fallen branches and hanging vines. His printed maps, despite being in a waterproof pouch, were smeared and difficult to read. Still, Jamie tried to remain calm. He told himself this wasn't the first time he had gone off course. "It's all part of the journey," he whispered aloud, more for his own reassurance than for any vlog. But the nervous flicker in his eyes betrayed the truth. He was no longer sure of where he was or how to get back. Every direction looked the same, the jungle closing in like a maze that rearranged itself behind his back. He used his compass to orient himself westward, hoping to trace his steps, but each detour only led to more confusion. Within an hour, the sun broke through the mist in strange, fractured beams, illuminating a world that felt increasingly foreign. Fatigue began gnawing at his confidence. He hadn't eaten since a quick energy bar that morning, and his leg throbbed from the earlier fall. Worse still, his satellite GPS, the one backup tool he relied on in moments of crisis, refused to reconnect. Just a red light blinking uselessly. He climbed a low ridge, hoping for a better signal or vantage point, but all he saw was more endless canopy. No signs of movement. No smoke. No sounds of civilization. The only noises were the rustling of leaves and an occasional distant screech, animal or something else, he couldn't tell. As dusk began to settle, panic danced at the edge of his thoughts. He tried to remember the survival advice he once gave so casually to viewers. Conserve energy, don't panic, find high ground, mark your trail. But without tools to track his location, every movement felt like a deeper descent into isolation. He found shelter that night in a shallow cave, little more than an indent in a mossy rock face. He boiled water with his portable kit and ate the last of his packaged jerky, forcing himself to chew slowly. Around him, the jungle buzzed with life, but it was the wrong kind of life. Jamie had been in rainforests before, he knew the rhythm of their creatures. But here, the sounds came in abrupt bursts, like coughing fits from the underbrush, or whispering wind that stopped too suddenly. Something stalked this forest. Not a predator in the traditional sense, but a presence that didn't fit the natural order. That night, as he tried to sleep, he heard the unmistakable crunch of leaves, 2 feet, slow and deliberate. He bolted upright, flashlight in hand, but saw nothing. Just the dark. Just shadows. He dared not call out. The next morning brought no clarity. His clothes were soaked through, the battery on his camera was dead, and worst of all, he realized his food stash was dangerously low. Only 1 meal's worth of rations remained. He debated turning back, but back to where? The jungle had devoured his trail like it was never there. And then came the worst revelation yet, his internal compass no longer aligned with the sun's path. He walked west in the morning and found himself back at the same clearing by afternoon. The cave he had slept in was there again, but the markings he'd carved into a tree, an arrow pointing north, had vanished. Not worn away, not rained off, gone, as if the tree had never been touched. A knot tightened in his chest. He was walking in circles, not because he didn't know where to go, but because something didn't want him to leave. Desperation bled into every thought. Jamie began yelling into the trees, hoping some lost hiker, patrol, or even an animal might respond. His voice echoed strangely, as though the trees absorbed the sound and gave nothing back. He screamed until his throat hurt, then sat down, clutching his knees, shaking. He didn't cry, he was too afraid to cry. Crying would make it real. He turned the camera back on, filming a raw, unfiltered message. Day 4. I'm lost. Completely lost. If someone finds this, tell my sister I'm sorry I didn't listen. The vulnerability in his voice was unrecognizable, even to himself. Jamie, the brave explorer, was gone. What remained was a man stripped bare by fear and hunger. His skin had begun to show signs of heat rash, his injured leg was inflamed, and he'd developed a headache that pulsed with every heartbeat. He stopped trying to film the journey. The camera became a weight he resented, a reminder of the vanity that brought him here. But still, he carried it, unable to let go of the one thing that tethered him to purpose. That afternoon, he heard something new, music, or what sounded like it. Very faint, carried on a breeze that came and went like a breath on his neck. It was rhythmic, distant, almost tribal. He froze, trying to locate the direction. It wasn't mechanical or recorded. It was alive. He stumbled toward it, branches whipping his face, thorny vines clawing at his arms. After nearly an hour of wandering toward the sound, it faded. But the forest ahead began to change. The trees were spaced wider, the ground firmer. He noticed carvings on certain trunks, symbols he didn't recognize, geometric shapes spiraling inward. He began marking his own trail behind him with a red cloth strip torn from his shirt, tying them around branches every few meters. But when he looked back 5 minutes later, the cloths were gone. Panic surged again. Were animals taking them? Was he hallucinating? It was then he realized he had stopped seeing birds entirely. The jungle had gone quiet again. Unnaturally quiet. Jamie pressed forward, now more out of instinct than intention. His thoughts became fragmented, skipping between childhood memories, camera settings, and fear. He whispered his own name aloud repeatedly, like an anchor. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat with his back to a tree, knife in hand, eyes wide in the darkness. He didn't know what he was waiting for, help, maybe. Or the end. In the black silence, a single question looped endlessly in his mind. Where am I really? Jamie was no longer moving with purpose. He was following instinct, a primal urge to survive, to find something, anything, beyond the endless crush of jungle. The air had turned thicker, as though the forest itself was inhaling and holding its breath. He trudged through waist-high ferns and pushed past thick vines that wrapped around his limbs like tentacles trying to drag him back. His skin was raw, bug-bitten, and sun-seared, and his shirt hung from his frame like damp paper. He hadn't spoken in hours, not even to himself, conserving what little energy remained. Just when his knees buckled and he thought he would collapse and die right there in the foliage, he saw something, wooden shapes in the distance, arranged too neatly to be natural. A cluster of elevated huts, thatched with dried palm leaves, resting on stilts like spindly legs above the jungle floor. Smoke curled lazily into the canopy, and the rhythmic sound of a hand drum echoed faintly. Jamie blinked, sure he was hallucinating. But the smell of firewood and cooked meat carried on the wind told him this was no mirage. He stumbled forward, almost crawling now, and emerged from the trees into a small clearing. The village was real. Real, but wrong. Time didn't seem to flow here. The air was warmer, thicker, almost syrupy. The village had no signs of electricity, no wires, no plastic, no metal, nothing that suggested contact with the outside world. The huts were made of bamboo, lashed together with vines, their interiors dim and cool. Villagers moved silently between homes, barefoot and dressed in hand-woven cloth that seemed dyed from earth pigments. They looked at him without fear or surprise, as though they'd been expecting him. An elderly woman with a deeply lined face and white painted markings on her cheeks stepped forward and touched his forehead with her fingers. She nodded slowly, speaking in a tongue Jamie had never heard. It wasn't Hindi, not even close. It wasn't any of the regional dialects he had encountered either. He tried English, then bits of Hindi, then just gestures, but she merely smiled and guided him toward one of the huts. Inside, a younger woman brought him food, boiled roots, a thick stew of unknown meat, and cool water in a hollowed-out gourd. Jamie ate without asking questions. His hands trembled with each bite, but the food tasted real and nourishing. As he recovered, he began to take stock of the people around him. There were only adults, mostly middle-aged or older. No children. Not one. And though they spoke to one another in soft tones, there was an eerie absence of laughter, of casual noise. The drumbeat never stopped. It pulsed faintly from a structure at the far end of the village, a circular building made of stone, unlike the rest. No one ever went near it. Jamie asked about it, pointing, miming curiosity, but the villagers only shook their heads, their expressions flat. Despite the language barrier, they treated him with care, tending to his injured leg with a poultice that soothed instantly. He tried filming some of it, recording the unique architecture, their faces, the strange symbols carved into tree trunks and on the walls of the huts. But when he played back the footage, the images glitched or went dark entirely. Sometimes the recording showed only static, Other times it was like the lens had captured something else entirely, indistinct shapes moving in the background that hadn't been there before. He tried transferring the footage to his laptop, but the files refused to open, corrupted beyond repair. At first, he assumed it was damage from humidity or the fall, but the way it selectively refused to record only certain parts, especially the faces of the villagers, gnawed at him. That night, as he lay in the hut given to him, the jungle's silence pressed against the bamboo walls. He heard chanting in the distance, not loud or overt, but layered and constant, like a hymn that had always been playing but he was only now attuned to. He stepped outside, camera in hand, and tried to follow the sound, creeping barefoot past the huts. The source was the stone building. Light flickered through slits in the walls, casting shifting shadows. He couldn't see inside, but he felt watched, his skin prickled, and the hairs on his arms rose. Then, without warning, a young man appeared beside him. Jamie hadn't heard a single footstep. The man stared at him silently, eyes blank, and gestured firmly for him to return. Jamie obeyed. Not out of fear, exactly, but because it felt like pushing further would awaken something. In the following days, Jamie remained in the village, growing stronger physically but increasingly confused. The villagers didn't ask who he was or why he had come. They gave him food, tended to his wounds, but never let him venture too far alone. He was watched, always. And each morning, the same pattern repeated. The same people performing the same tasks. He began to suspect they weren't living in days at all, but in a loop. One afternoon, he asked for a map, hoping they might indicate where they were. An old man handed him a folded piece of bark with symbols on it. When Jamie spread it out, he realized the shapes weren't land formations. They looked more like constellations. The village wasn't marked. Nothing was. He tried asking for a route out, but they didn't respond. They just smiled, patient and quiet. Jamie's dreams turned strange. He saw himself walking through the jungle endlessly, only to return to the same hut over and over. In one dream, he saw himself being pulled into the stone building, surrounded by masked figures, while the drumbeat became deafening. When he awoke, his nose was bleeding, and strange black smudges stained his fingers. His camera had recorded without his knowledge, capturing several minutes of him sitting upright in the hut, eyes open, whispering words he didn't understand. He watched the footage in horror, pausing on frames that showed other faces, ones that didn't belong to anyone he'd met in the village. They looked older, decayed, almost skeletal, standing behind him in the dark. The most terrifying thing came on the fifth night. He tried to film the sky, hoping to navigate by the stars. But the constellations were wrong. Completely. None of the usual markers were present. No Orion, no Big Dipper. Instead, unfamiliar star patterns blinked above like a different world altogether. It was then he realized that perhaps this village hadn't just slipped through maps, it had slipped through time, or space, or something more terrifying. This wasn't just an uncharted location. This was a place that wasn't meant to be found. Not by him. Not by anyone. Jamie tried to convince himself that his sense of dread was born out of exhaustion and disorientation, that his mind was playing tricks on him after days of survival stress. But the village refused to make sense. Days passed, or at least what felt like days, though the sun never seemed to move naturally through the sky. Time in the village dripped forward like resin from a tree, slow, sticky, and impossible to measure. Jamie began to notice small things disappearing, his batteries, his knife, his spare SD cards. At first, he assumed he was just misplacing them, a result of scattered thoughts and disrupted sleep. But when his secondary camera vanished from the satchel he kept tied to his wrist while sleeping, he knew someone had taken it. He confronted a few of the villagers with gestures, asking about the missing items, but their reactions were frustratingly uniform. Gentle smiles, soft murmurs, and slow shaking of the head. It was like questioning mannequins. He'd come to believe their kindness was just a well-rehearsed routine, masking intentions that went unspoken. He tried to document everything in a journal, carving small notes into a wood plank he'd scavenged when his paper notebook was soaked and ruined. But even those carvings began to fade unnaturally fast, as if the wood healed itself or time moved differently here. Then came the dreams again, more vivid, more intrusive. In one, He stood in front of the stone building and heard screaming from within, but no matter how hard he pulled on the door, it wouldn't budge. He'd wake up drenched in sweat with bruises on his arms and legs he couldn't explain. One morning, he awoke with dirt beneath his fingernails and his hands raw, as if he had been digging. He tried asking the villagers directly, this time more forcefully, even showing them the footage from one of the remaining clips that still worked, grainy frames of him sleepwalking. Still, no answers. They didn't stop him, but they didn't help him either. Instead, they just watched. Then he noticed the absence, no children. Not a single child in the entire village. For a place that appeared to operate as a living, breathing community, it lacked any signs of youth. No toys, no crying, no laughter. He asked, he gestured, he even mimed rocking a baby in his arms, but the villagers reacted with blank expressions or turned away. He once saw a small figure dart behind a hut, no taller than a child, but when he followed, there was nothing there. Just a row of handprints smudged on the wall, too small to be from any adult in the village. That was the first time he thought seriously about the possibility that something supernatural was happening. He laughed to himself bitterly at the idea, him, a skeptic who mocked ghost shows and urban legends, now entertaining thoughts of spirits and cursed lands. What truly pushed him past the line of rational denial was what he found inside one of the unoccupied huts. He had begun to sneak around when the villagers weren't watching, investigating structures that seemed to be either storage or long abandoned. In one, beneath a collapsed mat of woven reeds, he discovered a box of artifacts, modern items hidden under layers of cloth and leaves. A rusted GoPro, a cracked iPhone, an aluminum water bottle with English writing. He rifled through the box, heart hammering. These weren't decades old, they were recent. One of the items was a plastic ID badge, faded but readable. The face belonged to a woman, maybe in her 20s, a foreign aid worker from Australia. She'd vanished in the region 6 months ago, according to a news article Jamie vaguely remembered while researching his trip. Her name was Liana Crow. He stared at her smiling face for what felt like an hour, then tucked it into his pocket, unsure if he was more afraid of what her presence implied or what might happen if the villagers found him with it. That evening, Jamie pretended to go along with the village routine. He helped stir a large pot of food, handed woven baskets to the elders, and even joined a communal meal, all while hiding the ID badge in his boot. But that night, his dreams shifted again. This time, Liana appeared. She stood in the same clearing, her hair matted with vines, and whispered to him in a language he couldn't understand, but the terror in her eyes translated just fine. When he woke, the ID badge was gone from his boot. In its place was a small bone carved with a spiral symbol. He stormed through the village at dawn, demanding answers. His voice cracked, echoing over the quiet huts, as the villagers slowly emerged and gathered in silence, watching him with those same serene, maddening expressions. No one raised their voice. No one responded. He felt like a ghost screaming at statues. Later that day, a small group of villagers approached him. One of them, a man whose face Jamie had never seen before, wore a different robe, red instead of grey. The man handed him a small woven pouch and pointed toward the jungle. Inside the pouch were dried berries, some bandages, and a carved compass that didn't point north but rather spun slowly as if trying to locate something other than direction. Jamie thought they were offering him a chance to leave. With adrenaline pumping, he nodded and began walking toward the trail the man pointed to. But 20 minutes later, after climbing a hill and descending again, he was back in the same clearing. The village was exactly where he'd started from. The same people standing at the edge, watching. Only now, they weren't smiling. Jamie's paranoia spiraled. He stopped sleeping. He kept the knife under his shirt, sharpened daily with a rock. His beard had grown in patchy and coarse, and he barely recognized himself anymore. One night, driven by desperation, he climbed onto the roof of one of the taller huts and used the last of his drone battery to launch it upward. It climbed into the sky, its camera feeding live footage to his cracked phone. But the images it returned were chilling. The village wasn't alone. In every direction, surrounding it, were more clearings, each with similar huts, each seemingly abandoned. No roads. No power lines. No signs of movement beyond his own village. Just a pattern, a spiral of settlements, reaching into the jungle like a maze of forgotten lives. And then, before the battery died, the drone caught something else. A figure standing far off at the tree line, tall and cloaked, watching the drone. It didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there. Jamie froze. He didn't know what scared him more, that someone else was out there, or that the villagers weren't the ones in control of this place. The next morning, the drone was missing, and a new symbol had been painted in ash across the doorway of his hut. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew what it felt like, a warning. Or a countdown. Jamie was no longer surviving, he was unraveling. His days were now a blend of ritualistic monotony and paralyzing suspense, each moment spent waiting for a reveal that refused to come, though he could feel it building beneath every wordless glance and every movement among the villagers. They had stopped pretending to ignore him. Now, they watched openly. Every step he took in the clearing, every sip of water, every time he closed his eyes, someone was there, still and silent. It was as if the entire village had shifted its purpose, no longer pretending to care for him, but instead preparing for something. He caught sight of the red-robed man more frequently now, always on the periphery of his vision, his eyes unreadable. The drumming, too, had changed. It had grown faster, more erratic, pulsing in a way that Jamie could feel in his chest. It no longer sounded like music, it sounded like a heartbeat, and not a human one. Driven by fear and desperation, Jamie decided to return to the stone structure he had been forbidden from entering. He waited until the villagers were gathered near the communal fire for one of their silent meals, then crept through the dark, weaving between huts, keeping low, breath shallow. As he neared the building, the air around it thickened. There was a low hum, not audible, but perceptible through vibration. The door, if it could be called that, was sealed with thick vines that looked alive, pulsing ever so slightly. Still, he tore through them, hands bleeding, and forced his way inside. What he found defied all sense. The interior was circular, with a pit in the center filled with black ash and burned wood, surrounded by intricate carvings that spiraled outward in geometric patterns. Symbols repeated over and over, some matching those carved into the trees, others more complex, intertwined like veins. Around the room were remnants of the modern world. Watches, cracked eyeglasses, faded photographs, rusted keys, all laid out in deliberate patterns. One wall was covered in markings that resembled a calendar, though it didn't follow any calendar Jamie knew. Instead of months or days, it was divided by symbols, some resembling eclipses, some resembling human figures in various states of disintegration. One section of the wall had a series of charcoal drawings, all of them of outsiders, men and women of different ethnicities, wearing modern clothes, their faces always drawn with wide, terrified eyes. One figure had a camera around their neck. Another wore a green jacket almost identical to Jamie's. In the center of the room, above the ash pit, hung a large wooden mask, carved with a gaping mouth and hollow eyes, streaked with dried crimson. Jamie backed away slowly, heart racing, only to be met by the red-robed man standing in the doorway. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Jamie knew then that everything he had found was not meant to be seen. That he wasn't the first to arrive here. But he might be the first to understand the reason no one ever left. That night, the drumming stopped. The village descended into a silence so complete it made Jamie dizzy. He sat inside his hut, every instinct screaming at him to run, but he had no idea where to go. The jungle would swallow him again, and this time, he didn't think he'd find anything, maybe not even himself. Just before dawn, the villagers emerged, all wearing matching garments dyed in shades of black and ochre, their faces painted in white spiral patterns. They moved slowly, in a synchronized motion, toward the stone building. Jamie, half mad with fear but unable to resist, followed from a distance, ducking behind trees and crawling through underbrush. From the ridge above the clearing, he watched them form a circle around the stone pit. In the center, a figure was kneeling, bound and blindfolded. At first, Jamie thought it was one of their own, until the torchlight hit the person's face. It was the same woman from the ID card, Liana Crow. She was alive, or had been until recently. She didn't move. Her skin was pale, her body limp. The red-robed man approached the center of the circle and began to chant. The words didn't belong to any language Jamie knew, but they carried weight, vibrating the air like the pounding of an invisible drum. The villagers echoed his chant in low murmurs. Then the fire was lit in the ash pit. It ignited not like normal flame, but with a burst of blue light, casting unnatural shadows that moved independent of the bodies casting them. Jamie's mouth went dry. He wanted to scream, to charge in and stop whatever this was, but his legs wouldn't move. It was as if he had become a part of the forest, rooted to the ground, an unwilling witness. The ritual continued for what felt like hours. At its climax, the mask was lowered over Liana's face, and the chanting stopped. Total silence followed, and then the forest roared. Wind surged through the trees, animals shrieked in unison, and the villagers dropped to their knees, hands on the earth. Jamie fled. He ran until he couldn't breathe, branches slicing his skin, thorns tearing at his clothes. He collapsed in a dry creek bed, shivering. He didn't sleep. When the sun finally rose, if it was a real sun, he made his way back to the hut, unsure if what he saw had truly happened or if his mind had finally cracked. But when he arrived, he saw a new carving on the door. It was his face. Crude but unmistakable. Wide, terrified eyes. A gaping mouth. The same features as those drawn on the stone wall. That day, the villagers began treating him differently. They no longer avoided him or stared in silence. They included him in the chants. They painted spirals on his arms. They served him first at meals. One woman even handed him a bowl of soup and called him by name. That was when Jamie understood the truth. The village didn't kill outsiders. It absorbed them. One by one, those who arrived and couldn't find their way out were chosen. Not at random, but through some ancient system he couldn't grasp. Some became part of the ritual. Others became part of the village. But either way, there was no leaving. The place didn't just exist beyond maps, it existed beyond rules. Beyond escape. It was a living thing, and he was now inside of it, like blood in a vein. Jamie woke on what he believed to be the 12th day in the village, though it could have been the 20th, or merely the 6th, time had long since lost its grip. He was no longer sure whether the forest was letting him go mad or simply showing him who he had always been beneath the surface. The lines between survival and surrender blurred with each passing moment. The villagers no longer saw him as a visitor. They treated him as one of their own, sometimes more reverently than the others. They'd begun to prepare him for something, though they never spoke it aloud. They painted intricate symbols on his chest each morning, led him in ritualistic walks through the fog-laced jungle, and placed woven garlands around his neck made of flowers he was sure didn't exist outside this place. He no longer protested. In some strange, twisted part of him, he felt safer leaning into their rhythm than resisting. But deep down, a voice remained, buried beneath the exhaustion and fear. One that screamed to remember who he was, what he came for, and that he didn't belong. On the 13th night, that voice won. He lay in his hut, listening to the distant thump of the ceremonial drum, when he realized it was now or never. If he stayed one more day, he would forget everything. He would become part of the place, no different than the others, no memory of the outside world, just another echo in the ritual. He waited until the village settled into its nightly silence, then rose quietly and packed the few items he still had, a rusted compass, his almost dead camera, a bit of dried root they used for food, and a shard of mirror he'd found days ago. He smeared his face with ash to blend into the dark and moved without sound, stepping carefully between huts and avoiding the moonlight. The stone building still glowed faintly, pulsing like a beacon, but he didn't look toward it. He knew if he did, he might not be able to look away. He aimed for the opposite side of the clearing, toward where the drone had last flown before vanishing, toward the deepest part of the jungle. The trees seemed to resist him, branches catching his clothes, vines tangling around his feet, but he pushed through. His muscles ached from weeks of malnourishment, and every breath came like glass in his lungs. But he kept going. For hours he moved blindly, navigating by instinct alone. Once, he thought he heard footsteps behind him, soft, barefoot, synchronized with his, but when he turned, there was nothing. Only trees, silent and watching. He didn't stop. Not when he fell into a gulch and gashed his hand. Not when he passed markings on trees he didn't remember carving. Not even when the air grew cold and the sky twisted into unfamiliar constellations. He kept moving until he could no longer hear the drum. Sometime near dawn, he found the river. It was wider than he remembered and flowed fast, violently frothing over jagged rocks. But he recognized the curve in its path, the same one he'd seen on an old satellite image weeks ago. This was real. This was outside. Or close enough. He followed it downstream, ignoring the sharp stones beneath his feet and the constant sting of sweat in his eyes. A few miles in, he found the remnants of a collapsed rope bridge and, on the other side, an old trail, man-made, weathered, but unmistakably real. Hope returned like fire to frozen skin. He laughed, a broken, rasping sound that startled a bird from a nearby tree. He followed the path until his legs gave out, collapsing beneath the weight of exhaustion and delirium. That's where the forest guards found him. 2 Indian rangers, dressed in mud-stained khakis and armed with rifles, approached cautiously, unsure whether he was a vagrant, a ghost, or a wild animal. Jamie couldn't speak. He could only point back into the jungle, mouth dry, eyes wide. They carried him to their outpost several kilometers away, where he was fed, treated for dehydration, and slowly brought back to the world he had nearly forgotten. At first, they didn't believe his story. No one does. The village he described, its location, its customs, its people, doesn't exist on any map. Not in government records, tribal registries, or even old colonial archives. Search parties were sent. Helicopters combed the region. Nothing. No village. No structures. No symbols. Just endless jungle. Back in the UK, Jamie tried to piece his life together. His body recovered, but his mind remained fractured. Friends told him he was different now. Quieter, distant, almost hollow. He uploaded one final video to his channel, a solemn montage of jungle footage, disjointed clips, voiceovers describing what he saw, but never showing the village. The most disturbing part? His footage was blank. Everything from the day he entered the jungle until the day he escaped had either been wiped clean or was corrupted beyond recognition. His GPS logs stopped 3 days into the trip. His drone had been found 100 miles off course, its storage card missing. The shard of mirror he'd brought back with him now bore a faint spiral carved into the glass, though he had no memory of doing it. He tried to move on. He got a job editing travel content for other vloggers, staying behind the camera where things made more sense. But sometimes, late at night, he would hear the low thump of a drum in his dreams. Sometimes he would wake up and find dirt under his fingernails. Once, he woke to find a hand-drawn spiral on his bathroom mirror, fading as if wiped away just seconds before. He stopped questioning it. Stopped trying to explain what happened. Because the truth, he realized, wasn't meant to be shared. It was meant to be buried. The village didn't need believers. It needed silence, stillness, obedience. And maybe, just maybe, it let him leave not because he escaped, but because he was meant to carry something back with him. A seed. A memory. A reminder that some places don't want to be found, and once you've seen them, they never truly let you go.